So angiosperms are a group of plants which are called flowering plants, and they are seed-bearing plants and have ovules enclosed in an ovary, and angiosperms exhibit a very unique phenomenon called double fertilization. The male reproductive part of a flower is androecium, and the units of androecium are stamens, and the female reproductive part of a flower is gynoecium or pistil, and the units are carpels. Hello dear students, myself B. Shobarani from the Department of Biology, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, the Temple of Excellence. Welcome back to session 5, the last session of this very interesting chapter called Plant Kingdom. What are we going to study in today's session? By seeing this beautiful flower, you can assume it is none other than about the angiosperms. So angiosperms, we are going to discuss about a very important group of plants called angiosperms. I think all of us know that 3/4 of the plants that are existing on this planet Earth are the angiosperms. Angiosperms can also be called as flowering plants. Flowering plants. As we know, flowers are the most important parts of a plant body. They are the reproductive parts of a plant body. And you know, they are the fascinating structures of the plant kingdom. So what are angiosperms? Now let us study about these angiosperms. You can see this beautiful picture of lotus, right? So flower, that is the beauty of a flower. So what is the, I think all of us know, like in the last session we have studied, gymnosperms are called non-flowering plants, whereas angiosperms are called flowering plants. And also we have come across in gymnosperms that the seeds are naked. That means they are not covered over by a definite fruiting wall or a fruiting structure. But in case of angiosperms, the seed is covered by a definite fruiting structure called seed coat. So angiosperms are a group of plants which are called flowering plants, and they are seed-bearing plants and have ovules enclosed in an ovary, and angiosperms exhibit a very unique phenomenon called double fertilization. Double fertilization, and it can also be called as triple fusion. Double fertilization and triple fusion. So these are the highly developed plants producing flowers. So you can call them as what? Highly developed plants that produces flowers. And here the plant body is sporophyte, which is differentiated into root, stem and leaves. So what is the next characteristic feature of angiosperms? The plant body is a sporophyte differentiated into root, stem and leaves. Here I think all of you know that the angiosperms are broadly grouped into two groups, two divisions we can say, that is monocotyledons and dicotyledons based on the number of cotyledons. So they are classified into monocotyledons, that is single cotyledon, cotyledon in the seeds having only single cotyledon. Like for example, we come across the cereal crops, like it might be rice, ragi, wheat, jowar. They all come under monocot plants. And dicotyledon, the seeds having two cotyledons, like the pulses, groundnut and the pulses. So I repeat, what are the very important characteristic feature of angiosperms? They are the flowering plants or the seed-bearing plants, and having ovules enclosed in the ovary, and exhibit double fertilization and triple fusion. The process of fusion happens 2 times, hence the name double fertilization, and one of the male gamete fuses with the polar nucleus, which is already 2n, hence it will form 3n, that is a primary endosperm nucleus, hence it is called triple fusion. So these are the highly developed plants producing flowers. And here, as we know that the plant body produces what? The plant body is a sporophyte which is differentiated into root, stem and leaves. As we know, the root is the underground part of the stem, which is positively geotrophic and negatively phototrophic, and the shoot system, that is the part which is above the soil, which is negatively geotrophic and positively phototrophic, and as of course the leaves, which are the photosynthetic apparatus of the plant body. And we again classify the angiosperms into monocotyledons and dicotyledons based on the number of cotyledons. So a seed bearing single cotyledons are grouped into monocots, and the seeds bearing two cotyledons are grouped into dicots. Now, as I said, they bear flowers. See, so beautiful hibiscus flower. Hibiscus flower. Here you can see the stamens, and this is the petal, or we use the word called corolla. Here we can see the stigma. And this you can see the staminal tube. Staminal tube. So they bear flowers. As I said, these are angiosperms are a group of flowering plants. So they bear flowers which are meant for what? For reproduction. So as you know, the male reproductive part of a flower is androecium, and the units of androecium are stamens, and the female reproductive part of a flower is gynoecium or pistil, and the units are carpels. So the flower may be unisexual or bisexual based on the type of reproductive structure found in a flower. So the male sex organ in a flower is the stamen, that is the androecium produces stamens, that produces in turn what? The stamens produce what? Pollen grains, that is the male gametes, which forms a reduced male gametophyte producing two haploid male gametes. Then the female sex organ in a flower is what? It's a pistil, or the units of pistil or gynoecium is called carpel. That consists of ovary enclosing one or more ovules. So here the ovary will become the fruit. The ovary becomes the fruit, and the ovules will become the seeds. Right? Now, the ovule contains what? Highly reduced gametophyte called embryo sac. So I think all of us know that when you come across in the ovary, so this is the gametophyte. This is the embryo sac having, this is the embryo sac. Right. So the ovule contains highly reduced gametophyte called embryo sac with 7-celled 8-nucleate stage. So the embryo contains 3-celled egg apparatus, that is 3-celled egg apparatus. One is the egg cell, and the 2 are synergids, and 3 are antipodal cells, and 2 are polar nuclei. So if you come across here, these 3 are called antipodal cells. So this is the polar nuclei, 2 polar nuclei, 2 polar nuclei, and among these two, one is the egg cell and the 2 are synergids. The 2 are synergids. So in an embryo sac, we have what we call it as 7-celled 8-nucleate stage. 8-nucleate stage. So in that one, that is 3 are antipodal cells. 3 are antipodal cells. 2 are polar nuclei and 2 are synergids, and 1 is the egg cell. So it will become 7-celled 8-nucleate stage. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But 7-cell stage. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it is called 7-cell stage 8-nucleate. And I think we all of us know that the pollen grains from the stamen are transferred onto the stigma of the pistil by various agencies, which is called pollination. I think we have already come across a very, very important event called pollination. As we know, the gametes have to come closer together to enable a very important process to happen, that is fertilization. What is fertilization? It is the fusion of the male gamete with the female gamete, resulting in the process of formation of a zygote. But as you know that the female gamete is stationary and the male gamete is motile. So the two gametes have to come closer together they have to approach each other to enable or to facilitate fertilization. And for that very important event to happen, pollination is very important. What is pollination? It is nothing but the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower. And there are different agents which bring about the process of pollination. It might be wind, or it might be water, or it might be animals, or it might, and as we know that 3/4 of the flowers are pollinated by insects. As you know, insects play a very great role in the process of pollination. And the process of pollination through insects is called entomophilous, or you can also use a word called zoophilous, zoophilous pollination. Entomophilous pollination, zoophilous pollination, anemophilous pollination, then hydrophilous pollination, right? Then moving on, the pollen grain, as you know, once the pollen grains fall on the stigmatic surface. So this is the stigma. Here you can see this is the stigma. So for example, if it is a bisexual flower, then the stamens may fall on the same stigmatic surface, or maybe the stamens or the pollen grains from some other flower might fall on the stigmatic surface. But do you think the process of fertilization will happen? No. Why? Because only when the stigma is receptive, when it identifies the right pollen grain falling on its surface, then only it will allow the pollen grain to germinate. What is germination? The process of formation of a pollen tube carrying 2 male gametes. So that will not be enabled if the stigma is not receptive. So stigma receptivity plays a very great role in a very important event called pollen pistil interaction. So just stigma is like a landing surface for the pollen grains to come and fall, but it may germinate or it may not germinate depending upon the stigma receptivity. Then the pollen grain germinates to produce what? A pollen tube that passes down through the style and enter into the embryo sac. I'll show you in the diagram, right? So what is the next very important feature? The ovule contains highly reduced gametophyte called embryo sac, and the embryo sac contain what? 3-celled egg apparatus. One is the egg cell and the 2 are synergids, 3 antipodal cells and 2 polar nuclei. So the pollen grains from the stamen are transferred onto the stigmatic surface by a various agents is called pollination. And the pollen grain, once it is the right type of pollen grain lands on the stigmatic surface, then the stigma will undergo what we call receptivity, and it will allow the pollen grain to germinate. So pollen germination is will happen. That means there is a process of formation of a pollen tube carrying the 2 male gametes. Now, one of the male gamete, as we know, fuses with the egg cell. I'll show you in the diagram. These are antipodal cells. This is polar nuclei. This is the pollen tube carrying 2 male gametes. 2 male gametes. So one of the here, one is egg cell. This is polar nuclei, and this is antipodal cells. 3 antipodal cells, and these 2 are 2 synergids. So one of the male gamete goes and fuses. So one of the male gamete goes and fuses with the egg cell to form a zygote, and the other one goes and fuses with the 2 polar nuclei to form primary endosperm nucleus, that is PN. So here the fusion happens 2 times, hence it is called double fertilization, and because this already it is polar nuclei is 2n. So the male gamete is N. So the 2 gametes is NN. As you know, always the gametes will have haploid number of chromosomes, that is N number of chromosomes. Zygote will have 2n number of chromosomes. Here it is PN will be 3n. So this will be 2n. So zygote is 2n and this is 3n. This is zygote will have 2n after the fusion of the male gamete N with the female gamete, that is egg cell also N. So this is also N, this is also N. So when it fuses, then it will form 2N. Right? So one of the male gametes fuses with the egg cell to form a zygote, and that fusion of the gametes is called syngamy. Syn means what? Fusion. Gamy means what? Gametes. Then the other male gamete fuses with the diploid secondary nucleus to produce triploid primary endosperm nucleus. As I said, it will form what? So the other male gamete fuses with the diploid secondary nucleus, which is already 2N. So produce what? Triploid endosperm nucleus. Since fertilization takes place 2 times, one one of the male gamete fuses with the egg cell to form the zygote. The other male gamete fuses with the secondary nucleus, which is already 2n, one more time. So the process of fusion of the gametes takes place 2 times. Hence the name double fertilization, which is a unique feature of angiosperms. And as I said, it can also be called as what? Triple fusion. It can also be called as what? Triple fusion. So as we know, the zygote later develops into embryo and the PEN will develop into endosperm. So you know the zygote will not start its development until and unless it makes sure that some amount of endosperm is produced. Why? Because endosperm serves as the nutritive tissue for the developing embryo. See, it will make sure that first endosperm is formed. Then later on the process of development of the embryo takes place, and for its embryo development it requires what? Nutrition, and that nutrition is provided by the endosperm. So endosperm is nothing but the nutritive tissue. It is the nutritive tissue. So the zygote develops into an embryo with 1 or 2 cotyledons, and the primary endosperm nucleus develops into endosperm, which provides nutrition to the developing embryo. So the synergids and the antipodals degenerate after fertilization. So among this, the antipodal cells will degenerate or dissolve, and so also the 2 synergids will also dissolve. So they are of no use in the embryo sac. They dissolve. So during these events, ovules develop, as I said, ovules develop into seeds and the ovary will develop into fruits. Hence the seeds here are said covered seeds. As I said, the seeds are covered by a definite fruiting structure. They are covered over by a definite fruiting structure. So here the angiosperm seeds are not naked, whereas in gymnosperms the seeds are naked. But here they are covered over by an envelope, or what we use the word called seed coat, or a fruiting structure, right? Next, let us understand a very important phenomenon called alternation of generation. So that was about the characteristic features of angiosperms. Now let us understand the term called alternation of generation. How do we define this word called alternation of generation? Here, diploid spores producing sporophyte stage is alternated by a haploid gamete producing gametophyte stage. So alternation means what? One after the other. That means sporophyte stage is alternated by gametophyte stage. So that is sporophyte stage. Sporophyte stage is alternated by the gametophyte stage. So that means alternation of generation. What do you mean by alternation of generation? One after the other, alternating one after the other. So the sporophyte stage is alternated by gametophyte stage. It is called alternation of generation. Or we can also use that sexually reproducing gametophyte stage is alternated by asexually producing sporophyte stage. See, that is sexually reproducing gametophyte stage is alternated by asexually reproducing sporophyte stage. So you can define, this is a very important concept, and one question definitely you are going to get from this particular concept. So how do we define alternation of generation? Diploid spores producing sporophyte stage, or sporophyte stage is alternated by haploid gamete producing gametophyte stage, or sexually reproducing gametophyte stage is alternated by asexually reproducing sporophyte, that is asexually reproducing sporophyte stage. Or you can say sexual reproduction is alternated by asexual reproduction. You can also tell like this: sexual reproduction is alternated by asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is alternated by asexual reproduction. Now, in the alternation of generation, a haploid gametophyte produces gamete through mitosis. After fertilization, the zygote divides by mitosis to produce a diploid sporophyte. So, based on that, we have different types of alternation of generation, like haplontic life cycle, diplontic life cycle, and haplodiplontic life cycle. Now let us understand what is that. So whereas a diploid sporophyte produces haploid spores through meiosis. So the haploid spore divides by mitosis to produce haploid gametophyte. Thus, in any sexually reproducing plants, there is an alternation of generation between gamete producing haploid gametophyte and spore producing diploid sporophyte. I repeat. Thus, in any sexually reproducing plants like Angiosperms, there is alternation of generation between gamete producing haploid gametophyte and spore producing diploid sporophyte. Now, as I said, there are 3 types of alternation of generation in the life cycle. So, one is called haplontic, that is haplontic. Next is called diplontic, and third one is called haplodiplontic. What do you mean by haplontic? Where the haploid stage is more dominant. Here in case of diplontic cycle, both that is the diplontic stage is more dominant. In haplodiplontic, both haploid stage as well as diploid stage is dominant. So you can see in this picture. So this is haplontic life cycle and this is diplontic life cycle and this is haplodiplontic life cycle. Haplodiplontic life cycle. So all these 3 diagrams are very important from examination point of view. Definitely they are going to ask any one of the cycles. Either it might be haplontic life cycle or diplontic life cycle or it may be haplodiplontic life cycle. So now let us understand first one, that is haplontic life cycle. As I said, in haplontic life cycle, the haploid stage will be the haploid gametophyte is, that is in this phase haploid gametophyte is long-lived and diploid sporophyte is short-lived. So here in this phase haploid gametophyte is long-lived and the diploid sporophyte is short-lived. In diplontic, the diploid gametophyte is diploid sporophyte is more long-lived and haploid gametophyte is short-lived. Here both mixed. So here in this phase haplontic life cycle, in this phase the haploid gametophyte is long-lived and the diploid sporophyte is short-lived in the life cycle. So sporophytic generation is represented by one-celled zygote. Here you can see one-celled haplontic life cycle. So here meiosis in the zygote results in the formation of haploid spores and the haploid spores divide mitotically and form the gametophyte. So here the dominant photosynthetic phase is the free living gametophyte. So here the haploid gametophyte will be more dominant, where we find the sporophytic generation is represented by one-cell zygote. Meiosis in the zygote results in the formation of haploid spores and the haploid spores divide mitotically and form the gametophyte. So the dominant photosynthetic phase is the free living gametophyte. Here you can see the gametophyte, then gametogenesis, syngamy. You can see the zygote will undergo meiosis to form what? To form haploid spores. Here you can see N. So it is a haploid. So this phase is this is what? Haploid gametophyte stage. Haploid. So this is more dominant and this is the diploid sporophyte stage. Here you can see in diplontic the sporophyte stage is dominant and here you can see it is short-lived. Here it is equal, both are equal, haplontic as well as diplontic, right? Moving on to the next, diplontic life cycle. Here you can see in this is called diplontic. Here in diplontic, the diploid sporophyte stage is long-lived. In haplontic, that is haploid gametophyte. Gametophyte is dominant. That means it is long-lived. In diplontic, diploid sporophyte. Sporophyte is dominant, right? So here in this phase, diploid sporophyte stage is long-lived and the haploid gametophyte is short-lived in the life cycle. So the gametophytic phase is represented by the single or few-celled haploid gametophyte, and the diploid sporophyte is dominant. Here you can see the diploid sporophyte is dominant, photosynthetic independent phase of the plant. Here you can take the example of what? Volvox, Spirogyra and Chlamydomonas. Here we can take the example of gymnosperms and angiosperms. So, in gymnosperms and angiosperms, what is the type of life cycle you come across? It is diplontic life cycle, where the diploid sporophytic stage is more dominant than the haploid gametophytic stage. Moving on to the last but one, that is haplodiplontic life cycle. Here you can see both are equal. Here both, that is the diploid sporophyte stage as well as the haploid gametophyte stage is dominant. Here you can see both are dominant, hence the name haplodiplontic. Here only the diploid, that is the diploid gametophyte stage, sporophyte stage is dominant. Here haploid gametophyte stage is dominant. So it is called haplontic. Here it is called diplontic. Here it is called haplodiplontic. So here in this phase, both haploid gametophyte and diploid sporophyte stages have same duration in their life cycle. For example, you can take the example of bryophytes and pteridophytes. For haplontic, Volvox, Chlamydomonas, etc. And in diplontic, gymnosperms and angiosperms. In haplodiplontic, you can take the example of bryophytes and pteridophytes. Here both phases are multicellular, however they differ in their dominant phases. So a dominant independent photosynthetic thalloid or erect phase is represented by haploid. For example, if you take in bryophytes, so a dominant independent photosynthetic, as you know, the plant body is thallus. So thalloid or erect phase is represented by haploid gametophyte. Haploid gametophyte alternates with the short-lived multicellular sporophyte totally or partially dependent on the gametophyte for its anchorage and nutrition. So this is all about the types of life cycles which you have come across, right? Next, the microspore develops into female gametophyte and the gametophyte produce male and female gametes. And the very word itself will tell you, sporophyte means what? The plant body. Gametophyte means the gametes. So the gametophytes produce the male and the female gametes which undergo what? Fertilization to form what? Zygote that develops into an embryo, and the ovule into seed, and the ovary into what? The ovary into the fruit. But here the seeds are not covered by fruit wall, hence the name naked seeds. For example, like if you come across in gymnosperms, like we don't find the seeds covered by a definite fruiting structure, they are called naked seeds. For example, like you come across in Cycas, Pinus, Neetum, all these are the examples of gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are what? Non-flowering plants. Non-flowering plants and naked seed bearing plants. Naked seed. Both are seed bearing plants. Both gymnosperms and angiosperms are seed bearing plants. The only difference is in angiosperms we find that the seeds are covered by a definite fruiting structure, but whereas in case of gymnosperms the seeds are naked, not covered by a definite fruiting structure or a fruit wall. Hope you have understood the last part of this very interesting chapter called Plant Kingdom. So this is a very, very important chapter from examination point of view, where you get good number of questions from this particular chapter called Plant Kingdom. So hope you have understood all the concepts what I have explained in this particular chapter called Plant Kingdom. So I'll be back with a new chapter in the coming session. Till then, goodbye and thank you.